Hi, welcome to One on the Page. I am Scott. Today we're going to be talking about Stephen King's Insomnia. Let's get started. Now, if you've watched any of my videos before, particularly any of my Stephen King videos, whether it be ranking novels, talking about the 5 year battles that I've done, you know that I have already read this book. Not only have I read this book, I've read this book several times. And as I've said many, many times, I've read the last chapter of this book probably more than I've read any particular piece of writing ever, except maybe for like me signing my own name, but definitely any piece of published writing, the last chapter of Insomnia. So, which brings up the question, why am I reading this? Well, obviously, I'm reading it because one, I love it, obviously, or I wouldn't read it that much. Uh, Two, if you watch my Stephen King ranking of all his novels, you know that Insomnia is particularly a favorite of mine. I don't remember exactly where I ranked it, but I will put it up here. But I'm pretty sure I ranked this number two after it. And there are reasons that I ranked it above it, but not all of them have particularly to do with my own fondness for the book. This probably, uh, if you were to differentiate between favorite and best, best I probably would say would be it. Favorite will probably be Insomnia sometimes. But why am I reading it now? Uh, I am going to Maine this summer. I got as a Christmas present from my daughter Robin a trip to Maine, to Bangor, Maine, which is basically where the fictional town of Derry, Maine, uh, which pretty much most of it takes place in, uh, I would say, almost all of Insomnia. Now, there are other books in which Derry takes place. Bag of Bones starts out in Derry, uh, and there are 11/22/63. I know has a small uh, scene where Derry takes place. We also see Richie and Bev from It, and there are other ones that I'm not thinking off the top of my head. Uh, but since I was going to the fictional counterpart to Derry, Maine, or I was going to the factual counterpart counterpart to Derry, Maine, I decided to read Insomnia and It. I think the two biggest books in which Derry is a character, essentially. Now, it's less the case in Insomnia because Insomnia is an old man's tale. And so, while there are parts of the town that we see in Insomnia that we also see in It, uh, they're parts that in a senior citizen basically would see. And senior citizens generally aren't as exploratory as children are. So there are lots of places in it that we explore that when I go to Bangor, Maine, I will be seeing what it's modeled on, the standpipe, the barrens, the sewer grate. I'm going to be doing the Stephen King tour while we're there. So while I am reading Insomnia because it is set in Derry, Derry doesn't play as big a part in Insomnia as it does in It. Insomnia, if you don't know, is a story of Ralph Roberts. I believe in the book, he's in his late 60s, possibly early 70s, but I believe late 60s because he's definitely in his 70s at the end of the novel. His wife, Caroline, at the beginning of the novel, is dying. and he has developed insomnia, which I believe Stephen King has issues with insomnia. And I will say, I also have issues. My issues are actually a little similar to Ralph's, uh, up to a point. Ralph goes to bed fine, but then he wakes up, and then the next day he wakes up a little bit earlier, and the next day he wakes up a little bit earlier. And like Ralph, I don't have a problem going to sleep. I do have a problem. I often wake up several times, and sometimes when I wake up, I can't go back to sleep. But I definitely get more sleep than Ralph does. But when I first read Insomnia, which was when it came out in 1994, I was 24 at the time, maybe 23. I think it came out in October, so I'm going to say 24. Uh, Insomnia wasn't necessarily as much of an issue as it is now, but uh, I really, for whatever reason, I identified with Ralph. Ralph is the typical Stephen King everyman. Uh, Perhaps he would be the person that Stu Redman from The Stand might have become if he got to this age. He's a normal guy, has a normal job, not a writer, as is often the case with a lot of Stephen King characters. Uh, I honestly, he was a salesman. Basically, I forget what type of salesman he was, but back in those days when basically traveling salesman was a job that was not uncommon. Uh, and he is facing his wife's death. They have been married for a long time. We don't really get to see much of their marriage because when we meet Carolyn, she's kind of off to the side and she's dying. So we don't get a lot of Carolyn uh, in life. We do get some kind of mental flashbacks, and often the voice that Ralph hears in his head, kind of the voice of conscience, maybe is Carolyn's voice. And but we can see through his experience with her dying and her death, and how he is coping after that, they loved each other quite a bit, or at least it, I think Carolyn loved Ralph, but we don't really get to witness that. We know that Ralph loved Carolyn, and by everything we're told, same goes with Carolyn to Ralph. But Ralph is coping with her death and having insomnia. He is friends with a younger couple. He and Carolyn were friends. Uh, Ed in Helen, and they have a daughter, Natalie. And before Carolyn dies, Ralph has a run in with Ed at an airport. Uh, Ed runs into a truck, and Ed, who we are told through Ralph's point of view, is very much a laid back kind of, the phrase I would use is kind of a beta male kind of guy. Just uh, appears to have a happy marriage and everything, but he's really tearing into this much larger trucker, and that's kind of where Ed is introduced into it. And Ed is not the antagonist necessarily of the book, although he does play an antagonistic role. We soon learn that the marriage between Ed and Helen is not as happy as you might think. Whether that not whether or not that has to do with Ed's recent issues, we're not definitively told, but from everything I read, it's basically it was there, but maybe not as much as after things that happened to Ed. So this novel is slow. That's an issue that a lot of people have with Stephen King books. The hardback version that I have is 787 pages, and it takes a while to get going. If you're looking for like, oh, hey, let's get going, get some action going, this is not the novel for you. We get to slowly see Ralph's life, and and again, this was published in 1994. At the time, Stephen King was in his 40s. He was either born in 1947 or 1949. I think it's 1949. Uh, I mix up his and Bruce Springsteen's dates because they're not only are their birthdays very close together. One of them is September 21st, one's September 23rd, I believe, and the other one, and the years are 1947 and 1949. So I get them mixed up. I think Bruce is older. I don't know which was an older. So he's still in the 1990s. He's in his 40s. So as somebody who is now past his 40s, reading somebody who wrote in his 40s, I think King did a great job of writing uh, these older characters. People who have read King's recent works know that, like, as he got older, he maybe doesn't write, for example, children very well anymore. He wrote children very well before because he was writing at a time where, like in It, he was writing about essentially his childhood time. And he also had young children in the house at the time. So he would be able to do that. But now in the 2020s, for him to write like in Fairy Tale and The Institute, both excellent books, I think, but the children don't talk like children I know as somebody who has a 17-year-old right now. But he did an amazing job writing elderly people. I think he did an amazing job writing elderly people in Dolores Claiborne, also written 2 years previously. Uh, it seems like in his 40s is when he was able to start writing older people and women much better than he had previously in his career. And I think we see the case here too. Another main character, not our main character, is Lois Chase, who is like Ralph, a widow. She lost her husband a few years before, and she has some hidden depths that we don't necessarily see at first because we kind of see it from Ralph's point of view and also from his friend's Bill's point of view that kind of maybe clouds Ralph's view of her. Lois has got it together, but both Ralph and Lois are their main elderly people. And even though I really empathize and connect with these characters, they're not necessarily some of the same values we don't share, but I'm still able to empathize with them. And it to me, it's minor things, may not be minor things to other people. Ralph is sleeping less and less, and he's starting to see things. Uh, I won't get too much into it because I don't want to spoil anything. But if you go into this, be aware that there's discussion about abortion. Uh, and a abortion advocate is coming to Derry to make a speech, and there are uh, pro-life and pro-choice people, and quite honestly, there are idiots on both sides. So if you're, I think if you're worried about if King is saying one thing or another about abortion, at least in this book. I think you can go into it just looking at it like there are idiots on my side and there's idiots on the other side. Uh, I pretty sure King has his own view about abortion, but it doesn't really play too much in here. Also, if you know anything about the three fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, those kind of play a role in here. They are characters in this book, although not in the way you might initially think. There are nods to other books in here. At one point, a character from Pet Cemetery is mentioned. Mike Hanlon, major character in it, also shows up in this book. Joe Weiser is introduced in this book. He shows up again later in Bag of Bones, although basically just cameo in Bag of Bones. Oh, and Ralph Roberts, I think, is mentioned in Bag of Bones, but I won't be quoted on that one. It's been a lot longer since I've read Bag of Bones since I've read Insomnia. I'd probably have read this book, the entire book, since 1994, probably a dozen times. I read all of Stephen King in 2022, so I read it back then. I obviously read it when it first came out. I know I probably read it again right after it came out. So I think a dozen times is a pretty good estimate. Have my feelings about it changed? Not particularly. I still love it. There are still sections of the book that I enjoy more than others. There's, like I said, it reads slow, but there is part of it, probably a good 65% of the way through the book, where it does tend to like drag. It's kind of like, okay, especially as I know what's going to happen. It's like, I'm ready to move on. Again, the last chapter of this book is my favorite piece of writing ever. I can't estimate how many times I have read it. I would not be remiss to say if I read the whole book a dozen times, I probably have read that part 4 to 5 dozen times. I don't think that's a high estimate either. So, yeah, this does, will, and always shall get a 5 star from me. Uh, but I also want to talk about what's strange that this happened. I also got my copy of the most recent copy of Cemetery Dance, and in it is a new Stephen King short story. It is called The Extra Hour, and it is, coincidentally enough, about insomnia. It's a man, Danton. He's going to see the lawyer who's done his will, and he's basically asking, like, can anybody challenge me for being of sound mind if I commit unaliving? Which, uh, and he goes on to explain, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that he has insomnia. And he and Soames go back and forth, very typical kind of King conversation. And then Danton says, I got what I need, and he leaves. And then Soames later hears about Dan. And then Soames starts to have his own issues. I don't know how long the story is. In here, it's only 4 pages long, but as you can see, the print is quite small, so it's probably like if it were to be published in a collection, it's probably 10, 12 pages, maybe. It is his first short story that he's written in a couple of years. Last year, he published in They Like It Darker, uh, 7 short stories, which I had previously read, and 5 novellas that I had were published first in that collection. So it's the first thing that he's published probably since 2023 as far as short stories go. It's not a bad story, but it is very much what I expect. The insomnia, as I said, obviously, after talking about the book, it's not in new territory for him, but It's like, okay, well, you can write about the same types of things if you write it differently. And this Insomnia is different than the Insomnia and Insomnia. The rest of the story kind of follows well trodden path. Two characters talk. The character that is talking to the one leaves, and then the one who was talked to starts to experience the things that the previous one had been talking about. That's I'm thinking, is it Red Screen? This has happened before in Red Screen. I know it's happened in other stories. I can't think of off the top of my head. It's a very familiar trope for King. The ending of the story, it's also very familiar. I will also say, although there's a lot of differences between this and the Answer Man, the novella in They Like It, You Like It Darker, it kind of reminds me of that. It doesn't feel like its own story. It feels like Insomnia and The Answer Man and Red Screen and probably a few other stories were kind of thrown in a blender and kind of got a few shots of it, but it wasn't blended smoothly. So there's just chunks of it still left. I haven't thought about where I would rank it if I were to put it in my ranking of short stories. It's not. There were 115 short stories, so this would make this 116. I wouldn't put it with Man with the Belly, which is King's worst story, or even Stud City, which is next. I would guess that this would probably be somewhere like in the 80 to 90 range, or in the 80s or 90s. I would have to take a moment to think, and I don't have my list of these stories in front of me, so I couldn't say, oh yeah, it's definitely worse than that. It's definitely better than Man with a Belly. It's definitely better than Stud City. Far better than Man with the Belly. So but it's definitely not in like the top 75 stories. And if I were to like get a little window and just throw a dart, I'd probably say, oh, it's 93 out of 116 stories. Not a scientific answer, but I don't think it necessarily be far off. I could see it being in the hundreds, but the low 100s. But I 93 sounds good. Something that I am planning to do based on getting this and kind of looking at Stephen King's unpublished works is I am going to try to carve together a collection of works he has that are unpublished. And this includes I have seen short stories, novellas, uh, a couple of plays, poems, and I'm going to try to make my best version of a collection of works that have not been collected. Which means I'm not just going to take everything that's unpublished and put it in there. I'm going to take everything that hasn't been published, pick ones that I think, for one reason or another, deserve to be collected, and organize and arrange that. We'll see how it goes. I will tell you right now, I know Man with the Belly and Stud City aren't going to be in there. I don't think this is the best story ever, obviously, but it will probably be in there. I'm not much of a poetry guy, so I will have to, one, find poems that I can read. That's one thing, is that for the most part, if I haven't read it or am unable to read it, I'm not going to include that because there may be one exception, which I will explain when I do the video. So that's my next goal as far as Stephen King goes. So yeah, that was Insomnia. That was the extra hour. And looking forward to more Stephen King. I am like 150 pages into it, which is over 1,100 pages. But yeah, I will be talking about that before my main trip. I will also be talking about Never Flinch, the newest Holly Gibney book by Stephen King. That is published in May, so I will be talking about it either late May or early June. Well, not until then, but until the next video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll talk to you then.